Okay, according to the powers that be, we have 15 minutes to 1:30 for questions for all four. Maybe the four would like to come up.
Dr. Abdulnaser, first of all, I'd like to say shukran jazeer. I thank you so much for what you're doing for the children of Syria. My name is Ugoja Danma Eze. I'm actually an NGO, the United Nations in New York. So this is first-hand knowledge to me, and I understand and sympathize with you. Now, the aspect of education of children in war zones, more particular Syria, is of immense importance to me because I was a Biafran refugee 51 years ago. Now, what exactly do you feel that the international community, more or less the UN, could do for the education of children in Syria? And another aspect, I notice you're a medical doctor, you're focusing on the education of the children. What about the psychological impact of war on these children? Because as a former child refugee, over 51 years ago from the Biafran conflict, nobody thought about the psychological impact it would have on us, or even the fact of lack of education. I was out of school for 2 years. I was not educated for 2 years as we were stuck in Biafra. I commend you for what you do. Every day I advocate for children, women and children in conflict zones. I've actually written a book on the Syrian refugee crisis and US national security. I'll speak to you about that. We need to focus, the international community needs to actually focus on the psychological impact as well as a lack of education for Syrian refugees. When you speak about refugees, it's outside, but the international community, we tend to forget about the IDPs. You've mentioned this here in your presentation. There are children still actually in Syria who are suffering every day, not those who have been fortunate enough to get to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Turkey. I must commend the governments of these countries because they are actually suffering themselves with the heavy burden of the refugee crisis in their country. Okay, again, shukran jazeer.
Thank you, shukran. Actually, you know that the effects of this crazy war in Syria has many, many negative effects. And it's actually, I just wanted to shed light, little light actually, on education. I cannot actually speak all aspect even on education. Of course, we have many of negative effects. Some of the most important effects is health problem. You know that Syria announced 10 years before the war that it's free of poliomyelitis. Nowadays, it returned. Nowadays, many cases of poliomyelitis recorded and actually registered as renew not in outside of Syria during the refugees camps, which affect Lebanon, affect Jordan, affect many countries, even some recorded in Germany nowadays. The children who immigrated to Germany, they had poliomyelitis. And we can talk about many issues regarding of health problem. One of these important health problems is psychological background. You know that the children who, for example, witnessed their father who is killed in front of their eyes, who's laughed. So it is, we can imagine many, many of psychological problem. I think psychological problem could have a complete one lecture to talk about this issue because it is very important. You draw our attention to one of the most important dangerous thing. So I think this needs us to rehabilitate those children who are suffering from these very, very important psychological problem nowadays as a result of this, as I described it, crazy war in Syria. Yeah, thank you.
I think we have another question right here.
Thank you for all the presenters. That was very, very insightful and hope-provoking because especially my question is to the rabbis. I was delighted to hear of Israeli-Palestinian different reconciliation methods and attempts. My question is, how are you able to work with the oppressive Israeli regime that promotes apartheid wall, different highways debilitated for Palestinians and a nice one for Israeli plate, the checkpoint, and then every other day all the olive trees being cut by the settlers. So as long as these things continue, I am really perplexed about how the reconciliation hope is continuing when on the ground the government is working totally against that.
Thank you for the question. Loaded question, I would say. I think that there's a statement, obviously, in that question. So in answer to that, I would say that, you know, everything is relative in terms of the process, a peace process. What was true 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or 1 year ago is changing. Israel's not a perfect society, for sure. It has all of its, you know, shortcomings, and is definitely held to a higher standard in many cases than other states in similar situations. But relative to what was going on before, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, etc., there has been a lot of progress. Certainly the peace plan that's coming out now addresses in many cases, those issues that you brought up. Again, these types of things, you know, we work through challenges every day. There's setbacks. You know, the main thing is to focus on the positive and not on something that, you know, brought back all the other peace agreements for many, many years. But working through these things, these setbacks, working through every day, getting to a goal every day, you know, there's always challenges, and sort of getting over what, you know, there are many criticism, I think, all kinds of criticisms of Israel. But from a, as you were saying to the rabbis, from a more religious perspective, we do, like you said, we have to have hope for the future. And I really do personally have much more hope than I ever did, certainly with what's going on now. And even from a, you know, a biblical perspective, we are approaching some, you know, terms that really deal with a mutual prayer site, with mutual, all kinds of different ways of getting people together, you know, from a sort of a biblical perspective as well. Things are heading in the right direction, put it that way. Not perfect, but in the process, put it that way. That's about all I could say at the moment. I don't know if you want to.
Thank you very much. My question is related to the professor from Syria, Dr. Chudi Charles, who are actually from the eastern part of Nigeria. No, the theme of this conference is on the traditional mode. What efforts traditional rulers and indigenous, the problem in Syria, what effort have they made to reduce the conflict? Because we have been hearing about this for several years. What effort have they done to resolve the conflict in Syria? Thank you very much.
Actually, it is very complicated issue. It's not easy just to summarize it in words, but I can say it began very simple. It began a kind of what we called it continuation of what was called Arab Spring. It's a kind of the people, they went to the streets, want a kind of reform. And then it was taken by some big powers, neighboring powers, to take their interest, actually, and they moved it from very simple, as I told you, a continuation of Arab Spring, into nowadays, we can say it is proxy war. All big powers, every one of them, they have special interest with contradicts with other contrasts. And nowadays, not only the people of Syria, the people in the Middle East, they believe these big powers, if they want to solve it, not now, maybe a few years ago, they can solve it within a week. If they want to sit down on one table to negotiate each other, they can solve it. But because of many interests of those big powers, this war to still, this is why it is. Very briefly, we can say it is a proxy power. No more Syria. It's a proxy war. No more Syrian war nowadays. This is the problem.
Thank you. Thank you for all the presentations. My question is for Professor Ismael. I am a dispute resolution practitioner, and there is always this talk about how do we look at and or merge or incorporate traditional justice mechanisms into mediation practices. And maybe if I give a little bit of background, we generally get called in to mediate disputes that have already taken place. So you are sort of a third-party agency that comes in to mediate the dispute. Now, coming from a Western-trained kind of mediation background, going to work with people who are mainly in rural areas and sometimes indigenous communities, I think what is always a challenge outside of the theory is what is the practical steps that we actually should be doing. I think there's lots of presentations that have come out right now talking about the wonderful methods, but if you are coming into a situation and also time is a factor, what are the sort of immediate steps and tools that you can maybe suggest that people take into consideration and actually do?
Thanks, Noko. Yeah, there is always the practicalities, and I'm glad you point to that, because there is the theorizing, there is the aspirational, what we would like, and there is the what's going on now. Several things are going on at the same time. The suggestions cannot apply in every case for a number of reasons. But when you are called into a rural area, especially in Southern Africa, and the reasons why an outsider is being called can vary. One may be because the outsider has the resources which the locals may not have. And so recognizing why you are being called in may be the first thing to be reflexive of, why am I being called into this conflict? What are they looking for? What are the people who are calling me in looking for? And the easiest way is to ask them, actually. In most cases, they can be very, at least they've been very candid to me. And one time they told me, it's because you have money. The people around here, the government, don't have money. And so we sit here for 5 days and we starve. So you bring in the food as well. So asking the people who are in the conflict, what are they looking for in not only inviting you and what you can bring, but what they are looking for as the outcome of the conflict which they want resolved. That dialogue might lead to them indicating actually what process they want, rather than do you bring a prepackaged process. And they may come up with a very different process that they want to follow than what the UN or what I don't want to say World Bank might be prescribing. So those would be the first steps. What follows thereafter will now depend on, of course, on their responses and what they indicate as the preferred process for intervention. The intervention, and especially in South Africa, the South African, it may be rural, but those people are very assertive. They definitely know what they want.
Thank you. My question goes to the Rabbi. It's about the Israel-Arab conflict. We understand that this is the world's longest conflict, and it is as old as the United Nations, meaning that there is a package of demands from the Arabs towards the Israelites, and as well there is a package of demands from Israelites to the Arabs. Now this is the question: is there anything, if there is a package of demand from both sides, why can't these demands be fulfilled for a conflict to be brought to an end. Now that all mechanisms have been put in place and they have come up with nothing. I submit my question.
If I understood you correctly, your question is, we know what the needs are, we know what the interests are. What's the problem with actually moving forward? I will just simply address this question by saying I think that it goes back to what I was saying beforehand about how we analyze what the nature of the conflict is. And I think that for 25 years, or maybe more than that, the conflict has just been reduced to very westernized ways of interpreting conflict, scarcity of resource issues. There's only so much land, there's so many refugees, there's so much water, there's so many settlers, and there's a holy site which we don't know what to do with. And therefore there's been very kind of secular, westernized, paradigms of how to solve it. Can't we just all be mature, go for 2 weeks in some beautiful campsite in America and then solve this like grown-ups? The problem is that we're dealing with people's meaning systems, and the problem is we're dealing with people's, identities, and we're dealing with people's, victim, terrible, most Jews who live in Israel are children or grandchildren of refugees that have been traumatized, and Palestinians have been traumatized. We're dealing, we're talking about psychological scars that are going on here. So my what I think needs to be thought about is, instead of a doctor trying the same medicine over and over and over again and then being surprised when it actually causes sometimes more damage, is how are we going to think out of the box and include, for example, the religious leaders that have often been ignored and seen as only spoilers, but actually engage religious leaders and engage the really messy business of identity development. And I think that's why I'm here, is how does ethno-religious traditions can play a role in transformation of the hatred. It doesn't come to replace the political process that has to happen, but without a shift in people's perceptions of the other, I think any brilliant solution is going to be deemed as impossible. And whether we're heading towards a one-state, a two-state, or something else, we need to work on the element of hatred, which it's not a quick fix, but we have to invest in it.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the presenters.